Welcome to the American Intelligence Media. This is the Mike and Doug Show, also known as the Thomas Paine in the Ass of the Globalist, the spokesperson for Anonymous Patriots, and Michael McKibben, the spokesperson for the many people who are researchers helping the Americans for Innovation site come forth with the indictable evidence to put these Washington, D.C. people in jail. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, Douglas. Good to talk to you today.
Well, I got a question. The question is what you recently found in the mines basically the proof that basically what I would call rogue corporate intelligence agencies controlled the British government? I mean, that seems to be what you're saying. Can you tell us what it is you've been bringing up from the mines? Because it's going deeper and deeper, and pretty soon you're going to hit the core of the earth, and I don't know why the magma isn't streaming out of the mines that you're in. I really don't.
Well, you know me, I don't like to make statements that I can't back up. So for weeks now, somebody, I think it was in England, put us onto this track we've been on, and it got so interesting that I dropped everything to focus on it, along with a number of other people. And now I can confidently say this. We have discovered the origins of modern intelligence, and that origin is in the British Parliament, and it is staffed with newspaper men and women from around the world and has been since the beginning. Newspapers run intelligence. That's what we've discovered. It is just blowing our minds.
So
it's not the other way around. The newspaper men and women of the world, mostly men, in 1909, formed an organization called the Empire Press Union that was a spin-off out of an imperial press conference that they held in the summer of 1909, and it is clearly the case that the purpose of that union was to get all of the major newspapers from around the world, mostly newspapers, but also suppliers to newspapers, and we'll get into other areas in a minute, but specifically they got all of the newspaper men from around the world, including the Commonwealth, including American newspapers, and they recruited these people, and that became what we now call MI5 and MI6 and GCHQ. And then in the States, it's called FBI, CIA, and NSA. It has its origins on July 29th of 1909. We have the proof.
Well, it's even more shocking than that to me, because not only have you found the roots of fake news, which is in corporate intelligence, and we can see by that the date and the timing that this was the British East India Company had just been folded into the British government, and it seems as if the corporate interest of the British East India Company were the overriding factors. Now, what's shocking to me is what you just said, because no one has ever pointed out the sources of not only MI5, MI6, but MI1 through MI19 you've discovered, and the what is it called, the home and the colonies.
Home defense and colonial defense.
Yes.
That became the distinction between home was MI5 and colonial was MI6.
So you not only discovered that, you have discovered the Burroughs Wellcome Chemical Company, which is a story unto itself, which you have been revealing lately in conversations with us and some of the things that Americans for Innovation and Aim for Truth and the Cat Report have been putting out. A lot of information on the fact that chemical corporations were involved in a conspiracy, but it wasn't a conspiracy. They were overt about it even before the War Defense Board had their ultra-secret group, which you also discovered, and a little bit after Cecil Rhodes, but taking in that imperialism of Joseph Chamberlain and Cecil Rhodes and those good old chaps, and turning it into the Milner Roundtable. But in between, there seems to be a transference of British imperialism into empire building, colonialism, and the creation of the Pilgrim Society. So, can you pick up any of those threads, either the chemical craziness that adds to this story, or the Pilgrim Society?
Yeah, it's the core of everything from 1902 to this very day is the Pilgrim Society, in our opinion, and it is the largest and most nefarious group of self-styled elitists that this world has ever seen, and they're largely secret. Most people don't even know about it. And of course, now we know why nobody knows about it, because they control the press. They are the press. They control the press. And in addition to that, every other phase of human endeavor, whether it be education or military or banking or commerce, the specific strategy that the Pilgrim Society implemented. And by the way, the Pilgrim Society was formed within several months of the death of Cecil Rhodes in 1902. So by the summer of 1902, Sir Harry Britton had formed the Pilgrim Society with General Lord Roberts, who was the Army general that ran the Second Boer War with Viscount Alfred Milner. Now, all these people keep popping up, and we can now see that the Pilgrim Society was to be the extension of the Round Table, which Cecil Rhodes had convened, and it was to carry out his wishes to create a British imperial governance system that would be run by corporations all over the planet. And I think the reason they decided to do it that way and morph the British East India Company, because the British East India Company operated as its own entity, separate from the British Army, and they actually had their own army. And actually, Lord Roberts, by the way, was a lieutenant in the British East India Company. So there's this odd morphing of the British East India Company into the British government, and then they were then devising a new mechanism for giving home rule to colonies, which was ostensibly to be self-governing, but what they really created was a corporate way of maintaining control of these colonies, so they didn't really give up anything. And so you've got this empire building continuing with the British government through the Rhodes era, and it became the Pilgrim Society. And to this day, most of our there are hundreds of names of people in America that are pilgrims, and also in Britain. It's essentially the white racist mechanism that was created to continue the British Empire, and then also to bring America back into the British Empire, which was Cecil Rhodes' dream. That was the reason for him funding American students with the Rhodes Scholarships, was to recruit Americans to infiltrate the American society and make sure that eventually we were back under the British Empire. And so there's a lot of aspects of this, but out of the Pilgrim Society in 1902 came the Imperial Press Conference in 1909, and then the recruitment of the world press, leaders of the world press, into something called the Empire Press Union. This is news. It's the Empire Press Union that was the mechanism by which modern intelligence recruited newspapermen around the world to write fake stories, to devise mechanisms for making sure that the British won everything that they became involved in. And then you mentioned the chemical company, Burroughs Wellcome, which is now, current name is GlaxoSmithKline. Prior to that was Glaxo Wellcome. They sponsored the Imperial Press Union when all these newspaper men were recruited into intelligence, and they promoted their research in this very odd document that was the souvenir of the meeting in 1909, and it includes a whole section on their work with various pathogens and how, and they actually offered this medical kit so that these participants could take these pathogens back to their home countries with the ostensibly to provide cures. But what we see in this document are descriptions, specific descriptions of how to create vaccines that would kill people. And they even publish mortality tables on diphtheria tests that they were doing in a British mental hospital, and they very boldly discuss how many of the people died in the midst of their tests. So they were doing human testing. So the British have no excuse for self-righteously later complaining about what the Germans were doing with the same types of studies. And as you point out, Kaiser Wilhelm was also doing it in Germany, and that appears to be what Glaxo Wellcome was, not Glaxo, but Burroughs Wellcome was copying, was this mechanism for using human subjects to test a lot of these vaccines. And it also appears that this started occurring in the Boer War in 1902, which, by the way, also ended at about the time the Pilgrim Society started and Cecil Rhodes died. And in the Boer War, it looks like the turn of the Boer War was when there was an outbreak of typhoid fever and also the plague, bubonic plague, in South Africa in the concentration camps that Milner and Roberts, Lord Roberts, actually created, where about 60,000 blacks and whites, about equal, were killed and or died as a result of these pathogens that magically occurred, and they blamed it on the water. But it looks like Glaxo Wellcome was actually doing testing on human subjects. And when you read this, this sounds like voodoo science when you read a lot of this document. And I hope, I trust Betsy's going to link to that. But
Betsy
there
will.
You have it. We have the world press colluding with pharmaceuticals to introduce pathogens, and as we now know, people were very into eugenics back then. And this was the time of the founding of Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger in the U.S., and the philosophy of lowering the world population through war and drugs and chemicals was very much on their minds back then. And this document shows you that that's what they were doing.
Proudly,
I mean,
as a matter of
it's
fact.
shocking.
It's proudly. I mean, the two books together are, what'd you say, 1,000 pages. They're bragging about the white supremacy of London and of their Anglophiles. So they're bragging about the English. They're bragging about the Brits. They're bragging about London. They're bragging about the fact that this chemical company, Burroughs Wellcome, is going to go to war with the German pharmaceutical companies. And they literally are begging in an imperialistic way. And they literally say in that document you have found, which is shocking. It's so shocking that when you read it, at first you go, I don't get it. Because they are just so blatantly saying they're going to take over the world, and they're going to do it through war, manipulating Britain into a war with Germany. They clearly state that. Through their continuing colonization and empire building, but based upon imperialism, which they don't want to tell anyone. It's based upon white supremacist ideas.
Right. Well, let me just roll you forward a couple of years. Glaxo Wellcome then sponsored another conference, which was the first Universal Races Congress. Let me start over. First Universal Races Congress in London in 1911. Now, the interesting thing about this document, it describes exactly their attitude toward the colonies and toward their Commonwealth, the blacks and whites, basically. And when you read a Wikipedia entry for this particular conference, Wikipedia labels it an anti-racist conference. But when you actually read the document, it's exactly the opposite. It's a white racist comment that says things even like it's improper for the colonies to withhold the resources to the white countries who are better able to use those resources. I mean, that's the kind of stuff you read in this document, and yet Wikipedia labels it anti-racist. I mean, there's some propaganda for you.
And it's shameless. It's absolute, and we're going to go into the occult symbols and some of the illustrations they have there perhaps in a minute, but let's just go back to what you said, because I don't want this to go over people's heads. I want to give a summary of what you just said and add a few of my thoughts on this, and that's that down in South Africa, or all of Africa, the Europeans, most of them, especially the British East India Company, so the Brits, and the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch, and the Hanseatic League, the Germans, and then there were, of course, Italians and French and others, and Portuguese. They were all fighting over Africa. And they all thought it was their white supremacists, whether it be German Aryan or French or English Anglophiles, whoever it was, these white supremacists went down there and thought they could simply liberate the blacks by stealing their resources, their gold, diamond, oils, everything they can, enslaving them, shipping them off to other countries to be slaves, and then stealing their land. And this is what...
And resources.
This is what Cecil Rhodes did. Now, we know this is a fact, and we also know that in the Transvaal, where gold was found, and later where diamonds were found throughout South Africa, they simply stole it. And they created a monopoly.
Let's point out to people that don't know. Cecil Rhodes was financed by N.M. Rothschild to create De Beers, which everyone's heard of, De Beers Diamond and Gold.
That's where I'm headed with this. I'm going to point out that this was corporate interests from the beginning, with imperialism based upon corporate imperialism. And Rothschild, and I don't know the details, you'll have to explain this, with another person I think it was Asquith, were the representatives from the Fleet Street Council to the Parliament, so that these people who were developing this very astoundingly pervasive colony-building, white supremacist propaganda machine, which was really, at that point, it was newspapers, but later it became, the cable system and telegraph, and it became wireless. It became wherever communication was sent. And the point is, here's my point. Most of the conspiracy theory says, oh, we knew that. We knew that the fake news goes back to Rothschild's owning Reuters. Well, good luck finding the exact exchange. I know it is true because I have found it and we've given it as evidence to you. But the point is, the Rothschilds were a perfect example of the corporate imperialists giving money to the British East India Company, or crazy people like Cecil Rhodes, who then came back and became a hero to the British, or later to Alfred Milner, who came back and became a hero. He was a eugenist. He was using vaccines on
Milner was on the war cabinet in World War II.
Exactly. And you got Winston Churchill, who was a war correspondent. And again, war correspondents were part of the Burroughs Wellcome Company book that we're referring to, because the war correspondents, remember, they were the yellow journalists who could create a war by simply writing about it, something, inventing it. And
they were their top
propagandists. And so Winston Churchill was one of them. So don't think for a minute.
Now we're talking, sorry to interrupt you, Douglas, but just so we get these facts, we're talking about companies you heard of today: the Daily Telegraph, the London Times, the Manchester Guardian, the Observer, the Daily Mirror, the BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune. These were all players in this conference, and they became intelligence. I mean, this is just outrageous.
They are Anglo-American Pilgrim Society members who are white supremacists who owe their fealty to the Queen. Plain and simple.
Absolutely.
The Pilgrim Society gives their fealty to the monarchy of Britain.
The monarch is the titular head of the Pilgrim Society.
Now, let's go back to what they call empire building. Empire building is when a corporation like the British East India Company can come in and with swords and cannons steal the resources, enslave the people, steal the land, and then later sell the land back to them, put in a central bank, and control them for the rest of time. So this is the standard operating procedure for this. Now, what you have found is you are pulling back the curtain from people like Winston Churchill, showing that Alfred Milner was responsible for the death of 28,000 women and children, and perhaps another 30,000 in the concentration camps, and tens of thousands of others.
Women, children, and men. 14,000 of them were children in the Boer War, Second Boer War concentration camps.
And then they gave out inoculations, which were simply poison, and killed thousands of others with their experimentation with creating a typhus vaccine by taking typhoid fever bacteria, and injecting it directly into the bloodstream and then seeing what happens.
Yeah, they even give the formulas in this book for these press people to take back. And one of the interesting things about this document is Wellcome, the founder, asked everyone to be sure to provide the feedback to him about the results of their experiences with all these different experimental procedures. They even have a bunch of vaccines for acne, which doesn't exist to this day, and yet they're talking very confidently back in 1909 that this formulation will cure this kind of acne, and this formulation will cure that kind of acne. And it goes on and on and on. I mean, they actually show the microscopic pathogens in this document. And you got to ask yourself, why in the world would they do that in a press document? Well, now we know. Because what we saw after that, Wellcome then began attacking their main competition at the time, which were the German pharmaceuticals, and with these horrendous World War II propaganda posters. And that look like memes, by the way. And what we now see is that the newspapers of the world were the ones stoking war, completely stoking war. This is the only reason for these wars, where these newspapers were making up stories, and we actually have the documents now and proofs that they were totally making up stories about German extremists and making it sound to the rest of the world like it was mainstream in Germany to stoke up the anti-German sentiment, with the entire intent was to take out the German competition to their business.
Exactly.
All over the world.
That most important point of all, exactly what you just said, what they learned in the Transvaal, what they learned in South Africa, what they learned with the British South Africa Company, the same thing as the British East India Company, is that the Germans were their enemies. They were the number one efficient traders who were in fact undercutting them. So what did they do to them? They created chaos through war in South Africa, all throughout Africa. And in the chaos of the war, they moved in, they fleeced the resources, and they found who their enemies in Europe really were that were stopping them from their empire building. Now remember, the empire building was at first corporate. We've demonstrated that with the Rothschilds. And the Rothschilds went straight into the Bank of England, straight into the Parliament, as you've pointed out in the documents. And what is this? This is corporate intervention in foreign countries using government agents, what we usually use is the CIA, to protect corporate interest. Now, in this case, in the Transvaal, it was the Rothschilds who became the gold kings of the world.
Okay, let me stop you there. We say government agents as if it's not the newspapers. We are talking about using the newspaper people as the agents. That's who pushed our modern world, were newspaper men who were the agents of our secret governments. I mean, this is just unbelievable. Our newspapers are the fake news. They have always been the fake news. They have created all the impressions that we have as we've grown up about world figures, about world events. And now we're learning. Let's dig in a little bit farther into this Empire Press Union. which was formed in June of 1909, and it was July 23rd of 1909. And the reason we know that is that most of the evidence of this has been wiped, but some of our researchers just kept digging until they found it. One was in a newspaper in New Zealand, and another was buried in about 700 megabyte document for something called the Fourth Estate. And cut a long story short, the Fourth Estate article was very detailed about how this Empire Press Union operated, and it specifically said that it was created by the council on Fleet Street. Now, for those who don't know the geography, Fleet Street is within the London City Corporation, which is that square mile it's not a part of the city of London proper. It's its own organization, has its own government, and this includes the Inner Temple, which is the legal business in the UK, in the Empire. It includes on the other end of the street the banks, and now we know the newspapers were all organized there. So they were all within a walking distance of the various smoking clubs within the city of London. And these people organized modern intelligence off of Fleet Street, and we have the documents to prove it. And those documents show us that our entire corporate our impression of everything that we know today in history was created by newspapermen that were creating wars to make money for their banker buddies and their corporate buddies to drive stocks up and down, and that's what they've been doing our whole lifetimes. It's absolutely disgusting.
It is. I'm sorry to laugh, but it is. But what I'm going to say next is even worse. And that's the reason I'm laughing. You not only discovered the source of fake news, you not only discovered the source of both military and corporate intelligence. So let's go ahead and use the word
Empire Press Union. Keep that in mind. It's the Empire Press Union, the biggest secret kept from the world for 120 years.
And
this is going to rewrite the history of the 20th century, Douglas.
Because it literally comes back to a few people in Britain who thought they could take over the world with a plan of hegemony, of imperialistic hegemony, where they make a clear distinction. For all the lowlings below them, the non-elite, they get the Fabian society socialism. But for the elite, they have imperialism. Now, let's be clear what you have discovered. You not only discovered Big Pharma was behind the moment that all of this was created with the big bankers.
Big Pharma was behind the development of modern intelligence, yes.
And big fake news.
Yes. And
big corporate and rogue and government intelligence, which are three different things. And big military, which means the military-industrial complex, which means corporations. And the big corporations like the chemical companies that we're talking about, Burroughs Wells. And also at the same moment...
Burroughs, welcome.
But, excuse me? I always like to say Wells. I know someone named Wells. And then big government is simply paid politicians. And then who really controls it all? The lobbyists who control the spin of the media and who tells us what we're supposed to believe. So we don't need spies.
Society.
Yes.
It's the Pilgrim Society.
And that is the ultimate point. All of these people, and your list a minute ago, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all of the most corrupt media at that time were all swearing fealty to the Queen and to this big plan. This plan is the most comprehensive plan to keep humans as slaves and for eugenics and to use inoculations and vaccines as a way to wipe out people, as a way to use war and creating chaos so that what I call rogue CIA or rogue corporate intelligence can move in.
It's not rogue now. Now it's clear. It's not rogue. It is the organization. They're all in on it. I don't care whether it's FBI, CIA, NSA. They all know this origin.
Well, all
the insiders do at least.
This is the origin of AVID, ISIS management's control of the major media. I mean, look at Anderson Cooper and Mockingbird. He is a CIA agent. And so are a bunch of them I could list. The point is that programs have been developed in counterintelligence to make sure that the people delivering us our fake news are in fact spies. They're intelligence agents,
Yeah.
but
Who
we
was
now know
spying?
who they work for.
Who was spying on President Trump while he was a candidate? Robert Hannigan, the head of the GCHQ, which is a part of this group that was formed in 1909. Who is out there spouting this white supremacy crap? It's the media that are the white supremacists, and we have the documents from 1909 to show their commitment to white supremacy. And yet they're accusing their opponents of the very thing that they are.
Now, can you explain how that still controls America today through Serco and Crown agents?
Well, the press is still around. All those names I just mentioned are all still operating and going great guns, putting out the fake news. And they, in the British, part of taking control of communication was to take control of wireless and to take control of TV, radio, any media that was electronic. And in fact, in 1909, they had already started the process of co-opting Nikola Tesla's wireless invention under the name of Marconi, which was their fake cardboard cutout at the time. Marconi didn't do any of that, and yet they cut all their deals. They took control of wireless. They got the Congress, the Parliament, to fund wireless transmitter stations all over the world to communicate with the British Navy and with and to push their fake news. That literally, we're talking about the telegrams that the newspapers use to communicate their common message all over the planet. That was the purpose of these early transmitters, and they took charge of it through the British Post Office. And so from the very beginning, they've been about making sure that they had all of the communication mechanisms locked down. They created RCA in Canada, which they called Radio Corporation of America, which was really British. And then that was in the 1930s. So between the two wars, they had already started taking control of wireless and technology and telecommunications. And so I'll roll it forward. In the 70s, Sir Geoffrey Patty created Serco, which was going to be this consolidation of all these technologies under a single control, which they called Serco. And Serco then assumed all of the assets of RCA. And then and that carried forward into the 90s, into the 2000s, and then we saw a little sleight of hand where an organization called SI International was bought by Serco Britain, and already had American U.S. military contracts with Lockheed and Booz Allen and all the major U.S. players and Navy Space Wars. And then in 2006, Serco was given the contract. I mean, I'm talking before they actually bought into SI International. In 2006, they were given the contract to start managing the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and they were given the contract to approve all future American patents. And this was about the time that they were getting going on having stolen our software for social networking. They were starting to implement that. But then they were given the contract in 2006. They have now been given subsequent contracts, and Serco actually took over SI International in 2008. And now Serco manages all of the assessment of American patents to this day. Now, in addition to that, Serco, this one company, also manages 57 air traffic control stations in the U.S., in our aircraft space. They manage FEMA Region 9. They manage the Obamacare website. They manage the computer data systems for the Office of Personnel Management and for the GSA, the General Services Administration. They also manage prisons. They manage pathology. They manage many pharmaceutical companies, both in the U.S. and Europe. Now, this is one company. And clearly, this is the outgrowth of this monopoly on propaganda. And Serco is their technology provider for this unified intelligence organization that began on July 29th of 1909 and has not stopped to this day. And so
you
the British have about taken over America through this mechanism called the Pilgrim Society and the Empire Press Union. There we have it.
And it is shocking. And they also get their piece of USAID, OPIC, they get their crown agents, all the philanthropy. The Brits get their piece of the pie of everything. And we just found out that most of the cell towers are owned by a company that is actually British. We know that
let's give the name. It was Crown, the corporate name that became the group that consolidated ownership of all these towers was Crown something. I forgot the second
Crown
name.
Castle. And then it
Crown
turned into
Castle,
Aquiva because they always have to keep changing the names. But the point is that the globalists, this is their excuse, okay? But let me point something out. There's a thing called the Five Eyes Intelligence Agreement, which Michael also and his researchers found the exact moment that was created, and that really
June 5th of 1946.
And we should get out of that. But let's remember how the game is played. Five Eyes, 4 of them are British. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, which has 54 parts to it. But we're one part. But they and the Five Eyes.
This is the Empire Press Union, Douglas. This is the Empire Press Union, which updated its organization on June 5th of 1946 with authorization from General Marshall at the end of World War II. And that was a continuation of this 1909 agreement. There was nothing new here. They just formalized it further. And then, as we now know, by the 1970s, General James Fries, who was my first director, had organized Echelon, which then set out to spy on everyone on the planet. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at some very evil, satanic people that are running our media, are running our intelligence, and running our businesses. And they are tied with this pharma, this evil pharma that's heavy into vaccines, which, as we now know, are not all good for us. And the story has not stopped. So we've got 120 years of lies pushed through the intelligence world, which was in fact our newspapers.
And as you had already pointed out that the CIA had its sources in Britain, that now we're seeing Big Pharma had their sources. We know the big banksters had their sources. Of course, they got it from the Venetians and their model. But we see that Lockheed Martin, the golden share, is owned by who? The Queen. We can see that most of the major military-industrial complex contracts in America, the Brits get their share. We know that they were in control of uranium. We know that you can't name anything that the Brits don't have their finger in.
I need to mention with Serco that they have dozens of Navy Space Wars contracts. So this whole issue with the Internet of Things is all a part of this takeover of our communication, which has carried on for 120 years. This 1909 agreement has all been driven by who? By newspapers. Unbelievable. No wonder we can't get anywhere and we're experiencing all this fake news, because they're losing control of their ability to control our thoughts. And that is exactly what their documents say. They believe their purpose is. We've got documents from about 1923 where Sir Lord Burnham is doing a tour of organizations in the U.S. It was a speaking tour, and he spoke to the English-speaking society, he spoke to the Pilgrim Society, and he spoke to Associated Press. And those were his choices when he came over here. And by the way, he's the founder of the Empire Press Union with his father, and he was also the sponsor of the Imperial Press Conference in 1909. And he specifically said that it is the essentially, he said, it is the heavy burden of newspaper men around the world to create public opinion. Create public opinion. They believe that, and that's what they've been doing. And so
yes.
all this cognitive dissonance we see now. Trump is a wrecking ball to this strategy that they've had for 120 years. They are pulling out the stops to try to demonize him, and hopefully they're not. Their system isn't working. It's obviously working with a certain part of the population, but hopefully they're becoming wise to what's going on. And this revelation of the Empire Press Union should rewrite our modern history books.
Well, we're going to have to include intelligence agencies to be the fake news. And they're supposed to be the fourth estate. They are the fifth column. They are our enemy, exactly as Trump has called them. And I want to make perfectly clear that these transnationalist groups, these internationalist groups, they are globalists. And when we talk about our own CIA and FBI, you would think, oh, no, that's national, that's American. Wrong. No. Arvinder Sambai is the handler of Robert Mueller and James Comey. Yeah. And James Comey is nothing more than political theater. He's an idiot. He knows nothing about law. He knows nothing about law enforcement. And what is just amazing is that Andrew McCabe and Peter Strzok and all the rest of these people who are supposed to be working for America do not. They are globalists. Allison Saunders is the controller of the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations, which is nothing more than an extension of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which is nothing more than an extension of the Milner Roundtable, which is nothing more than the extension of the imperialistic Cecil Rhodes Roundtable.
Pilgrim Society. We need to focus, everyone, on two organizations, the Pilgrim Society and the Empire Press Union. Forget everything else. Those were all predecessors or successors and supporters. The Pilgrim Society and the Empire Press Union. An awareness of those two organizations should rewrite our history books.
And the Pilgrim Society still exists now. And the Empire Press Union, what's that called? Empire Press Union?
Commonwealth Press Union, the CMP
Media
Trust now.
There you go. Commonwealth Press
CMP
Union.
Media Trust.
Say it again?
CMP, they changed it, the Commonwealth
Press
Union, CPU Media Trust.
Yeah.
Commonwealth Press Union Media Trust.
Still exists today.
Yep.
And so that kind of blows the conspiracy theory that the Reuters controls it all and the Rothschilds control it all. But because of what you have found, we know that the Rothschilds were right there in all of this, supporting it, giving the money.
City of London. It was all in the City of London, which was the banking part of the City of London, the City of London UK Corporation. The banking part, obviously, the Rothschilds are quite involved in. But down the street, all within walking distance, is the Empire Press Union that really controls intelligence. So that's intelligence. And at the other end of the street, we've got the Inner Temple, the Outer Temple, the Queen's Court. We've got they've got the legal people tied up to take care of them.
Oh, the court is in the Queen's pocket because she has her own special court that overrules all of the courts. Plus, they have that special rule over there for the monarchy, which is you are not allowed to ask any questions about the monarchy's business. And recently, good old Bojo, who I'm adopting his hairdo now, I'm going to just not ever comb my hair for the rest of my life. And, Boris Johnson basically suspended Parliament, but what did he have to do? He had to go over and bend and scrape and ask the Queen for permission. Anyone who tries to tell me the Queen doesn't operate and control this entire mechanism is incorrect. She has the veto power. All she has to do is say no.
Very powerful feature of organization. They finally figured that out during the Home Rule period when they started issuing that golden share, which is a veto power. So you may not dictate specific policy, but you end up doing it by having veto power on any policy that is out there. and eventually just keep using that veto until you get what you want. It's very clever.
Well, Michael, is there any end to the gold you're going to bring up from this vein? Because if this isn't it, if there's something more beyond this, I don't know. I'm going to have to use an oxygen mask next time I talk to you, just so I don't pass out. Because to think that you now have found the exact moment for the big bankers, the big pharma, the big fake news, throughout Reuters, found out big corporate and what their connection is, big military, the Pilgrim Society, which controls it, which is nothing more than an intelligence network for the big government running their political theater scams on everyone, has been going on since the turn of the century.
120 years, almost to the day. July 29th of 1909. So July 29th of 2019 was the 120th anniversary of the scam.
Still going strong. And
Yep.
Just absolutely covered with conspiracy theories that give you pieces of this, but never the whole picture. I think it's amazing that you found this document from 1909 and the Imperial Press Conference, which I think you said you found, or someone found, in New Zealand or something. And
well, the clue was a New Zealand clue, and then when we started looking into the Wellcome Trust archives, we found the document, the book that they published at that conference. So we have pictures, we have names, we have dates, we have evidence galore here to prove that the alliances that we see today that are attempting to take down our republic are the exact organizations that were forming this group of alliances in 1909. Same exact ones. All they've done is passed it down to their children and grandchildren, which we've always said. We've always noticed that there was this dynasty of corruption. Well, now we can see exactly what they did. And with this, we've got the bookends, we've got the beginnings, and we've got current. And we're filling in the data now. And what we're seeing is this Pilgrim Society pretends to be this group that just gets together once in a while, has a nice dinner, and gives somebody awards. But what we're learning is that's the way these corruptocrats organize. They have to create, because a lot of them are public officials and they should not be seen in public collaborating with all of these different interests, they create these dinners and events to give people excuses to come and get together. Well, that's just the surface. What's going on behind the scenes is they're deciding what gears and pulleys they're going to use for their next scheme.
And the Pilgrim
and they
Society.
Get the bankers. Fleet Street's their best and easiest way of getting together, in the smoking rooms on Fleet Street in London. It's not that long, and they can walk. And on Fleet Street, it all gets organized, and then they send the orders out to Washington and New York and around the world.
And
That's
this goes
how it
on
works.
to this very day.
Yep.
And we see it with the Pilgrim Society, but we also see it with many other groups. And if you don't think this is affecting America, you're wrong. The Council on Foreign Relations is nothing more than an extension of
another
the Brits.
extension. Yeah. You take the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg, the Trilateral Commission. They're all extensions of the Pilgrims to do various tasks. And some of it's just misdirection. So by getting, if those looking at this get excited about the Bilderberg group, they'll show enough to get everybody excited and think that's the organizing center. I don't think so. The Pilgrim Society is the organizing center for all this, in my opinion.
Well, do you think there's any further steps here? Let's just consider the Pilgrim Society to be a domestic enemy. And anyone who is involved in it here in America is a domestic enemy because they've taken fealty oaths, which you shouldn't do, to a monarchy in another country. But it's not just the Brits. These are globalists. They're active in all countries all over the world. So, Michael, thank you for your amazing research and for bringing this nasty mold up into the bright light of the day and watching it die before our eyes. Once we know who the enemy is, then we can do something about it. So it's consciousness. Thank you for having that consciousness able to bring these things into the light.
You're welcome, Douglas.